Over the past 3 weeks, we've talked about ethics in relation to computer science education. We've talked about perspectives from students, how to integrate, and then we also talked about, well, when is there enough or too much ethics education in computer science education classes? But one area that we haven't talked about are perspectives of educators. So today we're going to talk about perspectives from educators on barriers and support in relation to implementing or integrating ethics into computer science education classes. And we're going to do that by unpacking the paper titled Incorporating Ethics in Computing Courses, Barriers, Support, and Perspectives from Educators. So it's written by Jesse J. Smith, Blakely H. Payne, Shamika Klassen, Dylan Thomas Doyle, and Casey Fiesler. Apologies if I mispronounce any names. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, incorporating ethics in computing education has become a priority for the SIGCSE community. Many computing departments and educators have contributed to this endeavor by creating standalone computing ethics courses or integrating ethics modules and discussions into pre-existing curricula. In this study, we hope to support this effort by reporting on computing educators' attitudes towards including ethics in their computing classroom, with a special focus on the structures that hinder or help this endeavor. We surveyed 138 higher education computing instructors to understand their attitudes toward including ethics in their classes, what barriers might be preventing them from doing so, and which structures best support them. We found that even though instructors were generally positive about ethics as a component of computing education, there are specific barriers preventing ethics from being included in some computing courses. In this work, we explore how to alleviate these barriers and outline support structures that could encourage further integration of ethics and computing in higher education. Now, if I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd say that this paper investigates the perceived barriers and support for implementing ethics into higher education courses. Now, even though this paper is talking about higher education, computer science education, I'm going to talk about this in relation to K-12 CS education, although it's applicable across all grade levels. Now, if you don't know who I am, my name is Jared O'Leary, and I've worked with every single grade, kindergarten through doctoral student, in a variety of contexts like music education and computer science education. For example, I've developed professional development and curricula used by educators and students around the world in computer science education classes. But now I create free content on my website, jaredoleary.com, which is where you can actually find the show notes for this episode, as well as 180 other episodes and a bunch of other computer science education content and gaming and drumming stuff, because, yeah, I like to create content. Now, the authors began by talking about how there are some different perspectives on how to integrate ethics into a higher education classroom, but then they mentioned that there hasn't really been much research on exploring the perspectives and the challenges of educators who are trying to implement ethics into their classes or who are unable to do so. So this paper explores 3 research questions, and so here they are from page 368. Quote, RQ1, what perceptions do computing professors have about ethics education in the computing classroom? RQ2, what barriers prevent computing professors from incorporating ethics in their computing classroom? RQ3, what support do computing professors need to help them incorporate ethics in their computing classroom? End quote. So in the methods section, they talk about how they surveyed 138 different participants, and they have a little table that is table 1 on page 368 that kind of like breaks down the demographics. And I just want to say, as a non-binary individual, I do appreciate that you include the non-binary category and you labeled it as non-binary, or you could also label it as trans, but it is way better than labeling it as other, which unfortunately I've seen a lot of scholarship do. All right, so let's get into the findings of this particular paper. So RQ1 is on the educator's perspectives of ethics. Here's a quote from page 369. Quote, 71.5% of participants disagreed or strongly disagreed that ethics topics should be taught by faculty from a department like philosophy or sociology rather than by computing faculty. Additionally, 61.3% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that their colleagues think including ethics in the computing classroom is important. 93% of participants agreed or strongly agreed that including ethics in the computing classroom prepares students for a career in computing after graduation, and 93% agreed or strongly agreed that students gain value from discussing ethics in the computing classroom. 76% of respondents reported that ethics does not take away from a student's ability to learn core computing topics. End quote. That's really interesting. So the professors mostly agree, hey, yeah, we think that ethics should be included. It doesn't take away from the classroom setting, etc. So maybe they kind of align with the paper that I unpacked a couple weeks ago that was talking about the different ways that you can integrate by embedding ethics throughout different assignments and whatnot, as opposed to having like a unit or like a standalone course specifically on ethics. Now, even though the vast majority of the professors agreed that ethics should be in computer science classrooms, 51% of them agreed or strongly agreed that not every topic needs to relate to ethics. So they said quotes like, hey, this is a math class, there's not really an ethical component to this, this, or we're just focusing on the technical rather than the practical application of this understandings, etc. But some people disagreed with that perspective. So here's a quote from page 369 from a participant number 89. Quote, "Someone I admire in computing education wrote earlier this year that he thought it was more important that his computing students understand communities and context than the details of the mathematics underlying computing. So I thought about what it would look like to think about communities and context with discrete mathematics, discrete structures courses. And it does feel like a disservice to teach anything touching on algorithms without talking about the conversations around algorithmic bias right now," end quote. Now, this is a really important question to consider. So one of the things that I've talked about in this podcast is how there's a tendency for like some subject areas to only focus on the content itself without actual application. Like for myself, math classes, I had no idea why I was learning pre-calc. Like it had absolutely no application in my life and has not had any application since I took it. If perhaps the teacher had actually said, here's when you're going to need to know this thing, then maybe I would have actually paid more attention in that class. But I mean, the same thing applies to like history classes, to science classes, etc. There's so much schooling that occurs that is completely decontextualized from actual real world application. And this is an idea that is often referred to as situated language and learning. And so we actually talk about that in episode 53, which was like well over 100 episodes ago, and is titled Situated Language and Learning with Brian Brown, which I highly recommend if you want to learn more about this concept. But if we are just focusing on like algorithms without actual application of when you might use those algorithms or how it impacts the world or the users who use them, then I would argue we probably aren't doing a great job of actually contextualizing or situating the understandings within real world application. But I haven't taught those style of classes, so maybe there's something that I'm missing here. This is just me kind of guessing, going off of the wide variety of classes I have actually taught. Now, to argue with myself, because I like to do this, having taught like band and drumline and things like that, those concepts and practices are applicable or situated within real-world context in terms of like, hey, the techniques that you're using right here, you could use on a gig or use for your leisure to perform, etc. But we don't necessarily talk about, well, how does this relate to ethics? Like I mentioned in prior podcasts, like there's a rosewood shortage, and rosewood is often used to be able to create instruments like marimbas that I played on as a percussionist. Should we spend time in lessons talking about the ethical implications of actually practicing an instrument that is causing some deforestation issues? Or should we spend that time just focusing on how to perform better on an instrument that uses the rosewood? So on one hand, I agree with the participants who say that ethics can be embedded in so many different ways. But on the other hand, I can think of some arguments where, okay, well, maybe it is situated, but it might not necessarily relate to ethics, which I'll actually unpack a little bit more in the lingering questions at the end of this podcast episode. Now, another perspective that the authors explored is when should we actually focus on ethics? So 23% of the participants said that the students need to learn a base understanding of computing skills before they can actually explore ethical issues. And that of those 23% of the participants, 62% of them said that they did not actually include ethics in their own course. So my guess is those kind of professors were teaching like CS 100 courses, like an intro to computer science. Here's the very basics that you need to learn. Now, in the professional development that I created, one of the things that we really were intentional with was trying to not create some overwhelm. So we didn't want to introduce like a new computing concept in addition to a new pedagogical concept simultaneously, because it would create some overwhelm with the teachers who were participating in the professional development. So what we'd often do is just focus on, we're going to model something without actually telling you why we're doing it this way, some pedagogical approaches, and we're going to introduce some of the computer science concepts and practices that you're going to need to be able to use to be able to create a particular project. After we have finished creating that project or getting the majority of the way through it, like to a point where, okay, they clearly understand this, maybe there's some more work on it, but they're good to go, then we would actually use the framework TPACK to unpack it. What was the technical knowledge that you needed to know? What was the pedagogical knowledge that you need to know? And then what was the content knowledge that you needed to know? Be able to create that project. And so at that point, we would unpack, okay, well, did you notice that I used a different type of assessment this time? Let's talk about how I use this, when you might use it, etc. The same thing can apply for ethics. At what point do you introduce the concept and the ethical problem at the same time? Do you want them to focus on one or the other, or simultaneously? There's no right or wrong answer that works for every scenario, so something that we as educators need to really think about. Now, if you are like the majority of the educators in this study and think that ethics should be included in a classroom, this kind of leads into RQ2, which is on the barriers to ethics integration. So at what point are you going to run into a roadblock that might prevent you from actually integrating ethics into your classroom? Now, 42 of the 138 participants did not actually include ethics in their course. And if I were taking that survey, I would have been one of those as well. I did not focus on that in the classroom. And it's something that I'm looking back on going, I should have done that more. But I'll talk about in the lingering questions section when, okay, maybe that doesn't actually fit because of the focus that I chose in the classrooms that I worked with. Now, of those participants who did not incorporate ethics into their coursework, the 42 of those participants, 40% of them said that there were specific barriers that prevented them from doing so, while the vast majority, 60%, said no, there weren't really any barriers preventing me from doing it. So what were these barriers? Because this might help you as an educator, whether you're a kindergartner or in higher education or whatever. So one of them was just simply a desire to leave ethics into other classes or other courses. So those educators just did not think, well, this didn't really belong within this particular content area. Maybe it was so niche down that they didn't think that it was applicable. Like the example of going to lessons for learning how to play marimba, and then instead of doing that, you're actually learning about the shortage of rosewood. The next barrier is that professors thought that some other topics had higher priority. Like there's so much technical stuff that we need to learn that we don't have time to really focus on the ethical. Now, I would argue, as somebody with a PhD in a subject area, that there is never enough time to learn everything that you need to know about a particular subject area, especially in a single course. As I mentioned in other curriculum episodes in particular, there is this concept known as the null curricula. So the null curricula are the things that are left out of a curriculum. So whether it's a course or a degree or whatever. Even though I have 3 degrees in music education, I still do not know everything about pedagogy and content knowledge related to music and music education. And I know that same thing applies for every single domain out there. So there are always other things that are going to be left out of a coursework. And what you need to figure out is, where is that balance between whether or not you should include something or not include something? But as we've talked about in other episodes, should your weight be focused more on the technical or more on the theoretical or the applied understanding of the technical? Can you apply the understanding if you haven't learned the technical? But at what point is it saturated enough that you've learned enough of the technical to learn how to apply it into the ethical? Again, no right or wrong way of doing it, just some more things that we have to think about as educators. The next barrier is kind of related to that, so it's just the general idea that, well, ethics doesn't really relate to this particular content. The barrier after that is that they felt like they could not control the curriculum. So having worked in higher education, I do know that sometimes the professors are kind of handed a textbook or handed a full curriculum that just basically says, here's what you're going to teach on what specific days, and here are the assignments, etc. So if you are like a faculty associate or something like that, you might not have control over what is actually taught within that class. You can still find ways to incorporate discussions on it. Maybe not make a full assignment or change the assignment to focus on it. Or maybe you can by just focusing around a particular theme. But after an assignment is completed, you could say, cool, we just learned this thing, we applied it. Now let's talk about the ethical implications of the concepts and practices that you just learned. How might what you just created impact the users or communities that are going to use or not use this particular app or product or whatever? And the next barrier is that participants mentioned not having enough time, incentives, or encouragement to actually integrate ethics into their classes. Again, with the time thing, there's always going to be null curricula. There's never enough time to learn everything. I still know just a fraction of what it means to be a music educator or to understand music education. And the same thing with computer science. Even though I've been in this field for about a decade, I still have so much to learn and understand. And then the last barrier that some of the professors mentioned is that ethics actually distracts from working on the core computing concepts. So here's an interesting quote that kind of summarizes this from page 370, and there are a bunch of other interesting quotes throughout each one of these sections. If you want to see what professors said, I do highly recommend taking a look at this article. Quote, ethics instruction is unquestionably essential for computer science students. Ethical mistakes in computing can have disastrous consequences. However, adding ethics to courses on algorithms or discrete mathematics is distracting and ineffective, end quote. So the author of this particular question really understands the importance of this thing, but then says, yeah, but it takes away from this other thing that they view as more important. And what I wonder is, are we focusing too much on the love that we have for a particular content area without actually thinking about the application of it? Now, an interesting subsection in this particular research question is that they mentioned that 67% of the participants agreed or strongly agreed that they felt confident in being able to actually integrate ethics and apply it into their courses. Now, next week, we're going to actually explore an article that explores the perspectives of K-12 educators. And we're going to see that educators don't necessarily even understand what ethics is. So even if they are confident, they might be confidently focusing on equity instead of ethics. So stay tuned for next week's episode that kind of unpacks that more. But the authors do mention that even though more than 2/3 of the participants said that they're confident in doing it, that it would definitely help to have more professional development or support structures to be able to implement ethics within the classes. Now, I would argue from a K-12 perspective that those support structures would largely come from administrators, whether it be like administrators just being able to allow more time for things or encouraging teachers to modify like existing curricula to include more ethics. So if you are like a department chair for a computer science program in a district, or you are like a mentor, educator, or an administrator, or whatever, maybe you can find some ways to incorporate more ethics within the classes that are taught in your district. Now for RQ3, they talk about some of the structures that support ethics. So of the professors who are doing this, what helps them out to be able to integrate ethics into their classes? So the first one is additional resources, and these are specifically like online resources to be able to make it so that the professors don't have to generate ethics-related content or assignments from nothing. As somebody who has professionally created like well over 100 lesson plans that are used by educators and students around the world, with each one of those lesson plans averaging like at least a dozen pages, I could say it takes a lot of time to be able to design higher education courses, which I've done that as well, or to be able to create lessons, content, curricula, etc. So to be able to like draw from a pool of resources that are available, or like assignments that include ethics, etc., that makes your life so much easier. It's just one less thing that you have to worry about as an educator. Maybe you might like take one of these resources and modify it to make it more customized for the students that you're working with, but that is a whole lot easier than having to come up with something on the fly, especially if you're not as familiar with ethics as some of the K-12 teachers are in the paper that I'll unpack next week. But I will point out that some of the professors who responded mentioned that, hey, I actually prefer to create my own assignments and whatnot, and I would have done the same thing and did the same thing when I was in the classroom. Now, the second thing that supported integrating ethics into computing courses was collaboration with others. So this could be other faculty members within your department, or maybe even outside of the department or outside of your school or even district. As one of the professors mentioned, they kind of question the ethics of some of their other colleagues, which I'm sorry, I've been there, done that, left that organization where I was questioning that as well. So I know exactly what that feels like. But there are ways that you can actually collaborate with people who are ethical, who might not be within your like organization, corporation, higher education institution, or whatever. And the last thing kind of relates to this is just having a community. So this community could be in their department, it could be like peers in the field, it could be like just a general research community, or even a conference community, like meeting up at a group, or talking with other participants or audience members at like a conference session at like something like SIGCSE or CSTA's conference, whatever. But this could also include like digital communities. So going on to Twitter or other online communities like CSTA's community board and other resources and whatnot. So there are many ways that you can kind of connect with or collaborate with other people. So the support structures for number 2 and 3 are kind of like hand in hand, collaboration with others and community. And I guess it could also go hand in hand with the first one, in that you could kind of collaborate on creating additional resources that you then share in your community, etc. Which is one of the things that I do. So like my website, I've got hundreds, if not thousands, of free resources on my website because I've been working on it for over 20 years now, sharing a bunch of like drumming stuff. There's over 1,400 hours of drumming content on there. I'm sharing a bunch of gaming stuff. And then there's a ton of computer science education stuff that was like the lesson plans that I previously created for the classrooms that I used to teach, or the lesson plans that I professionally created that were used by teachers and educators around the world. All of those things are available for free because I want to be able to help people, because I totally understand how helpful it can be to have additional resources. And I had the benefit of like not having kids and having a wife who was also very busy. So I had plenty of like quote unquote free time to be able to create these resources and share them for free with other people. But I understand that not every educator has that opportunity to do so. Now in the discussion section, they kind of talk about some of the things that I mentioned that were in the findings. So I just kind of embedded my own perspectives on the discussion. But if you want to read this, I do highly recommend it. You can find a link to it in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. At the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to share some lingering questions and thoughts that I had while reading through the paper. This is not a critique of any of the authors. It's just me kind of sharing some wonderments. So one of them that I kind of mentioned earlier is, if we consider null curricula, won't there always be not enough time to learn the technical, especially when it comes to introductory courses? For myself, one of the ways that I tried to like acknowledge this and teach around that was acknowledging that if I taught how to learn and providing more resources than there was time to actually learn, this would help students to be able to continue their learning down the road after the course ended. As I mentioned in episode 66, the role of deliberate practice in the acquisition of expert performance, which I unpack some scholarship on sports psychology in relation to computer science education, I talk about how it takes thousands, if not tens of thousands, of hours of effort and deliberate practice to become an expert within a domain. Now, if we take that into consideration, any degree or series of degrees or even a single course is not going to be enough to help somebody become an expert on a topic. So how might we teach to focus on long-term learning beyond the course or beyond the degree itself to encourage that lifelong development of expertise in a particular domain? So if you want to learn more about that, check out episode 66, which I do link to in the show notes. But another question that I have is, if integrating CS into another content area, are we further diluting CS by also focusing on ethics? So for example, one of the things that I talk about is how, if we think of like a Venn diagram, so we have like two circles, and one circle is like the, science, and the other circle is computer science. Now, where they overlap, that little portion in the middle is going to be the thing that we might focus on when integrating computer science into a science class. But if we also now include a third circle, that is ethics, on top of that, are we narrowing our scope so much that we are ignoring all the things that are outside of that little narrow scope that are within each of the other domains? So the more lenses that we apply onto a particular area, does it make it so that we cannot actually focus on learning concepts and practices that do not exist within that particular nexus or intersection? Now, again, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but it's something that's important to think about, again, in relation to the null curricula, which has kind of been the theme of this particular episode. So now, as an example of what I'm talking about here, so one of the things that I've mentioned so many times in this particular podcast is my emphasis on focusing on interest-driven learning. So students would come into a class. If there are 30 kids in the class, they'd be able to create 30 unique projects using multiple different programming languages and platforms to be able to create something that was uniquely interesting to them. If I had a requirement that there had to be some kind of ethical component to explore or discuss or understand or whatever, would that then narrow the scope so that students would be unable to actually explore their interest within that class? Now, on one hand, I can think of some examples where that's a definitive yes, but on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, I could see how we might be able to at least discuss it, but it might not be the primary focus for the different types of projects that students like to create. So while I agree that ethics can and should be incorporated into the classroom, different pedagogies may or may not lend itself toward that kind of integration. And then the last question that I have is, how would this compare like the perspectives with elementary, middle school, and high school educators? What barriers and perspectives or layers of support might each of those grade bands have? And we're actually going to explore that a little bit more in next week's episode, which will kind of wrap up this little mini-series on ethics in computer science education. If you enjoyed this particular discussion, please consider sharing it with somebody else or leaving a review on whatever app that you're listening to this on. It just helps more people find it. I do create this content full-time, and I create all this stuff for free for you to use. So sharing with somebody else not only helps me out, but it also helps out other people to find the hundreds, if not thousands, of free resources on my website, jaredoleary.com. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.